So can I just start by reminding you of the success criteria for this session that you've signed up for? What I'm aiming to do in less than an hour at quite a romp is to go through the key elements of that teaching session for guided reading, that working with the small group. We'll focus in particular on the role of the practitioner, the teacher or the teaching assistant that's leading that group. And we're also focusing on the role of questioning to check on the children's comprehension. We will hopefully have time to just consider some of the practicalities of guided group reading, because it all hinges on how smoothly the activities go. I will, at the end of the session, in the last slide, give you a link to access a Google folder where there will be the slides from today that you can access, and a host of the resources that I mentioned during the session. So they'll all be in there for you to download and access should you find them useful. We will all very briefly at the end of the session consider the question of whether or not you think it necessary or valuable to record any assessment that you do as an adult when you're working with groups of children for their reading, and I'll share some materials with you there. So I'm going to crack on. In our curriculum for Wales, the development of learners' reading knowledge and skills is central to, of course, language literacy and communication, AOLE. In the second of our 4 statements of what matters, reading is there writ large, but it's also there in our 4th statement of what matters, laying out expectations for a reading curriculum in each of our schools, and in many cases across clusters of schools. So why guided reading? Well, at its best, guided reading is a part of a school's reading curriculum to develop ambitious and capable readers, and will help learners to develop independence as readers. Each teaching session will model the reading process, how to get ready to read, how to focus on understanding when reading, and how to reflect on reading. And this is a model for learners to use themselves with growing competence and independence over time. This teaching session enables a group to focus on reading that's specific to their stage, their ability, and enable the practitioner that's leading to tailor the session to the needs of the group. This small group activity is a time for practitioners and for learners to discuss their enjoyment of a text, their understanding of the text, and to respond together to that text, trying to deepen their knowledge of how literature works, but also how to appreciate and connect with that literature. So the guided group reading, a stable of many of the schools in our region with regards to a reading curriculum. So just briefly, before we start to look at the teaching session itself, perhaps it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we mean by looking at developing children's reading strategies. The simple view of reading is one which identifies 2 broad categories of reading, both decoding and language comprehension. Learners with both good word recognition, so their phonemic knowledge and their sight word vocabulary knowledge, plus that good language comprehension, they will have a strong reading comprehension overall. They'll be fluent and understanding of what it is that they're reading. These kinds of learners read for meaning. They understand that they have to be active in making sure that they understand what they're decoding. In our schools, we aim to move all our learners towards that top right of that diagram, where they are effective in their word recognition skills, and they're also effective in comprehending what it is that they decode. Guided reading when it's done really well, enables us to work with small groups of learners to really focus in on the appropriate balance between decoding and comprehension with each of the groups in our classroom. So thinking about learning and teaching of comprehension in particular, the Education Endowment Foundation have published literacy guidance for schools for all stages of the primary and the secondary phase education. The Education Endowment Foundation Improving Literacy in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 guidance, both of them make recommendations regarding the importance of teaching pupils to use strategies for developing and monitoring their own reading comprehension. They suggest that reading comprehension can be improved by teaching pupils specific strategies that they can apply both to monitor, but also to overcome any barriers to their understanding what they're decoding. These strategies support children to interact with the text, to identify key points, make inferences, and to understand what they're reading. So as you can see on the slide here, and behind the image on the slide sits a link to the original guidance documents, if that's of use to you. But here they talk in the Education Endowment Foundation about 5 key strands for developing reading comprehension strategies. And these they reflect on being a useful point of focus, not only for us in primary, but actually up into secondary when applying this across the curriculum. So they talk initially about the importance of being able to activate prior knowledge so that pupils are able to think about what they already know about a topic before they start reading, both from other reading experiences, but also those first-hand experiences at home, in the community, and in school. And this allows them then to be able to make links with what they already know and what they're about to come across in their reading. They also advocate the use of prediction as a comprehension skill, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. The idea that when pupils predict what they think might happen as they read a text, this helps them to pay really close attention to whether or not what they predicted is actually coming to happen, and they can check in with their reading as to whether it makes sense in relation to their predictions. It helps to tune them into that level of comprehension beyond just the decoding of those words. Similarly, a focus on encouraging children to be able to generate their own questions, to be able to think about questioning a text to make sure that they have understood. Is this making sense? Is that what I expected to happen? Does that make sense with what I already know? They also focus on the skill of being able to clarify, and in this case, they talk about it being children being able to identify areas of uncertainty, things that they're not quite sure about, and having the presence of mind and the understanding that when they're not sure, there are things that they can do to help develop that understanding, whether that be understanding of particular vocabulary and what words mean, understanding of unfamiliar phrases, or about understanding of sentence structure or punctuation. So it's about keeping an eye on having to clarify sometimes what's not very clear initially. And finally, that 5th strand that they focus on in their recommendations is the ability of children to be able to develop the skill of summarising. Pupils focusing on what's the key information that I've gained from what I've read and that I'm reading. Is this making sense to me? And being able to, in the earliest stages with our younger children, sequence information, what happened first, what happened after that, and what came next after that. But for older children, as they develop, being able to summarise key parts of what they're reading as a way of demonstrating that understanding. So I'd like to suggest that coming across these strands of comprehension, this actually is what a lot of our work in a guided reading session is about promoting, developing and enabling children to be aware that these strategies are what takes them forward with their reading. So let's think for a moment then in particular about working with a group in a guided reading session, that teaching group with the adult. Just some basic principles which are very straightforward. So generally with the teaching group, that is made up of a small group of pupils who have been assessed and identified as being of similar need, similar ability. How schools do that varies from many of our schools using something like the PM benchmark materials to accurately assess children and diagnose where their strengths and areas for development lie in relation to decoding and to comprehension. But the teacher then identifying and grouping groups of learners by similar need. Then each of the children in that group then will, with the adult, the teacher or the teaching assistant, they all have their own copy of a text that has been chosen for that session. And wherever possible, the teacher will have one too, obviously. The session then is really reliant on the fact that the text that the children are using for that teaching session is very accurately matched to the group. It's really important because the children are going to be asked to read the text to themselves with a degree of independence in that teaching session, supported by the teacher and each other by going through a process that repeats every time they meet. The teacher guides the group through this familiar sequence where they get ready to read, and then they read, and then they reflect on their reading together. So I think it's fair to say that most teaching sessions in that guided reading follow a really familiar sequence, a model that we want the young readers to use themselves when they're reading on their own, and that repetitive use of what do we do before we read and then we read and how do we reflect on our reading is something that we want the children to do independently when they go to the library to choose a book, when they're sitting at home reading their own book, when they're working with a partner as part of their curriculum work. So that time before the children get reading is dedicated to getting them ready, providing them with a purpose to read for the session, and by also helping them to identify what are the reading strategies that they know how to use. And that will vary dramatically by the age of the children and the ability of the group that you're working with. But again, by that accurate assessment in grouping the children, you'll have a good idea about what it is that they need. The teacher then will prioritise perhaps one or two focus areas as the lead into the reading session. This introduction, if you like, before the children get reading, is meant to be relatively brief and just enough that the children feel confident and ready to be successful when they read. They know what they're doing and they're aware of what they know how to do if they come across a word that they're not familiar with. Because the texts are chosen to be at that instructional level, that 90 to 95% readability, that match is really crucial. We want children to practice using those reading strategies with unfamiliar words, but we don't want them to be so many that they become disheartened and that they don't feel able to have a go. So before they get going with their reading, as the teacher, you'll pick perhaps one or two particular strategies that you want to focus in on with the children. And again, I'm going to refer to the Education Endowment Foundation model, the example with the 5 reading comprehension strategies there, as being a useful guide in when we're deciding how will we set this session off, what do the children need to get them going. For example, with a number of young children, what we need to clarify with them about what they know how to do are those basic decoding strategies. So in a number of schools in our region, teachers and whole staff have devised visual prompts to support that idea of consistency, focusing on a familiar range of strategies with children through the school so that we can see the kind of progress that they're making, and we can support the children to be able to talk about the reading strategies that they have. On the left-hand side here of the screen, you can see where a teacher has created what she called her reading hand, which she uses to support the children to demonstrate that they do know a range of strategies, particularly to decode. So they know that they need to push the buttons or sound out in relation to the phonics. They know that when they see a big word, they might need to break it into 2 parts before they use their phonics. Obviously, they're being taught that looking at the picture and getting clues from the context in the picture is a reading strategy that they need to be able to use alongside referencing the text. So this idea of having a go-to collection, a set of success criteria of reading strategies that we're training the children to use, we're teaching them to employ when they're reading, and reminding children at the beginning of the session and encouraging them to tell us, what do we know how to do before we get reading? There are further examples of strategies that start to look more at that wider range of comprehension and higher level reading. And for example, on the right-hand side of the slide here are a few from a resource which I know that I've shared with a number of schools when I've done guided reading previously, looking at some of those comprehension skills that are around children being able to use the construction of the sentence to help them work out unfamiliar words, being able to visualize what it is that they're decoding to support them in their comprehension, knowing that if they come across a word, if they use their phonic knowledge and it lets them down in some way, that rather than stopping, that perhaps if they move on to read on to the end of the sentence and come back, that sentence construction, that context might just help them to identify that word alongside the decoding they've done. So it's about that range of reading strategies that the children are familiar with and that we can refer to at the beginning of our guided reading session. If you're interested in that resource in particular, there is a link that sits beside the top image and is in the collection that I'll share with you at the end of the session. So what strategies are we going to use when we're reading today? A short introduction, activating the children's prior knowledge, perhaps focusing in on what questions are we going to ask as we read today, perhaps doing some work around that prediction. These are the kinds of things that we might choose. It's almost a menu that as the teacher you choose from at the beginning of the guided reading session with that group in mind. What is it that's going to, what do they need that's going to support them to get going with their reading activity? And as our children become more confident and more capable with their readers, in particular with the range of these comprehension strategies, As you can see on the screen here, what the EEF advocate perhaps is more that the teacher becomes a prompter to encourage children to use those strategies for themselves when they are reading. Teacher prompting them to question as they read, prompting them to relate what they're reading to what they already know and activate that prior knowledge, and so on. And it might be that you find that the prompts on the slide there might be a useful reference point when considering how teachers are prompting comprehension as the children get a little older. So before we get reading, the children have that text, it's matched to their ability. As the teacher, we've an idea about which particular reading strategies are going to be the focus for the session, and we're encouraging the children to remind themselves about what they already know how to do in terms of decoding and comprehension strategies. And we provide the children with a purpose for reading. And during then, we hand over to the children and we encourage them to read to themselves for a period of time, using those strategies that they are familiar with the text that's really closely linked to their ability level. And we encourage them to have a go to overcome those difficulties that they come across with those few words as part of their reading. What the teacher will do is encourage the children to read to themselves independently their text. So we're not talking here about children taking it in turns around a group to read aloud while others listen and perhaps follow, or not sometimes, but rather, instead of that round robin type reading, guided reading oftentimes will be the teacher inviting the children all to read themselves to themselves of their text at the same time. What this means for younger children, where they're still reading out loud and they haven't developed that internal reading voice, is that, of course, we're using whatever techniques we can to encourage them to read aloud, but using perhaps that special reading voice, and we don't underestimate the difficulty that that can cause. However, talking quite slowly whilst they read aloud. Again, I was in a school recently where the teacher was talking to the children about their reading mumbling, so that they were just about reading aloud, but only enough so that they could hear it themselves, and trying to train the children into that habit. For better readers, they can be encouraged to use that internal and develop that internal reading voice so that they become more and more adept at reading silently to themselves. The reason why it's suggested that all children reading at the same time to themselves is a really good approach to employ is that this tries to ensure that all children in the group read all of the text, rather than prioritising reading the part of the text that they perhaps know is going to be the part that they're reading aloud. There will be exceptions, of course, where you perhaps want to particularly focus on punctuation and expression, and it might be that on those occasions, perhaps you do focus on the children reading aloud and listening to each other as an audience to focus on expression and fluency. But generally speaking, what we're perhaps trying to advocate, and what I've seen used really successfully, is the idea of the children having a go themselves. So the idea here then, if you're the teacher working with that group, where the children are older and more able readers, if they're reading silently, we still want that opportunity to listen in. So we would encourage the children in turns to use just a little whispering voice so that we can listen in to those individuals, so that we can assist them with the problem solving and the use of strategies that they're using for those more challenging words or phrases, so that we can praise and confirm when they're using strategies effectively, when they manage to overcome one of the barriers that they come across successfully, or at least if they try to use a variety of strategies, that we can give them praise and some feedback about that. When we are able to listen in as well, I know in a number of schools, teachers are encouraged to just make a very brief note during that listening of the strengths or perhaps those issues that the children are demonstrating as they read aloud. And for the younger children, where they're all reading aloud, hopefully, as we're training them into those quieter voices, the teacher can listen in and do that same job. It is true to say that starting this, if children are used to round robin, then this initially will be a little noisier than we're used to. And I think children quite quickly get used to just focusing in on what they are doing. We're trying to develop those individuals in terms of their resilience and the use of the strategies that they have. So setting up the reading so they're ready to go, providing the children with a reading purpose, a task to have something to read, and listening in to individuals as they read where you can. And then after reading, once the learners have finished reading, we can encourage them to reflect on what they've read, thinking about enjoyment and engagement first, wherever possible, so the children see this reading activity as purposeful. It's about what we're finding out. And then we can focus in on their ability perhaps to use those strategies. I've included on the screen here just a screen grab of some of the descriptions of learning from our Statement of What Matters For. Literature fires imagination and inspires creativity. Because as I started the session saying, what we want in these sessions after the children have read, isn't it great if our starting point is asking them to respond to what they've read in some of the ways that are described in the descriptions of learning? So expressing opinions, offering ideas about what they like and what they don't like, commenting on the kinds of questions that they have, about the kind of information that they found out, about some of those higher level skills with regards to beginning to sequence and summarize that information. So I think as a starting point, what have we found out? What did we enjoy? Before then moving to start to think about what did we do well? What did we manage to overcome? What did we do well in terms of our reading strategies? And again, returning back to this model, the teacher is likely to guide the readers to reflect on their comprehension, and doing that particularly through discussion, pairs of children, individuals targeted with questions, or as a whole group reflecting on what they've been reading, talking about the text with the students, inviting them to give a personal response. What did you like about it? What did you enjoy? What were you surprised about? Asking the children to make connections between what they've read and something perhaps that they've read before, something that they've seen on the television, something that they've noticed when they're talking with their friends. Those 5 comprehension strands again come into play to help us as the teacher to choose and focus in on which of these particular strands do we want to use to guide that discussion and to check on the comprehension of the group that we've been working with. So, for example, as you see on the screen there, if the children were doing some prediction work before they read, is this something we're going to return to them, and how did we get on? What did we expect was going to happen? What did we predict? Is what we read about what we expected? And that might be the driver for a discussion. It might focus in on, as I mentioned earlier, connecting and comparing with what they've read before, so that activating prior knowledge. What does this remind us of what we've read? How is this similar to other things? Is this by an author that we're familiar with? Are there similar themes in what we've read here, particularly as we start thinking about our older learners and those higher level comprehension skills? So I do think that this model is a really helpful one for thinking about preparing the children to read, but also reflecting on the strategies that they've used during that reading. So I just want to share with you a resource that I've seen a number of years ago. I came across this being used in a school, and I've seen it more and more in schools, and I'm sharing it quite widely. If any of you are interested, the Reading Vipers is a tool to use to support us as the adults coming up with questions to promote and prompt the children to reflect upon their reading and their comprehension. The VIPERS stands for, as you can see on the screen, vocabulary, inference, prediction, explaining, retrieving, sequencing and summarising, which, as you can see, sits very nicely alongside that Education Endowment Foundation model about comprehension. So what the model does is give a selection of question prompts, which are particularly useful if, as a teacher or a teaching assistant, you're sitting working with a group where you don't have a lovely teacher's resource that gives you a set of questions for the text that you're using with the children. Often when you're using guided reading on a daily basis and you're on that carousel of different groups over the week, it's very, very unlikely that teachers have time to plan for every different text across that classroom, the range of questions to suit those texts. So for me, in the reality of the classroom, the Reading Vipers are a little go-to toolkit that we can use as we're working with our children to target questions to develop those skills. So just to give you an example, if we were working with younger children and we really wanted to focus in whether they were able to clarify the meaning of particular vocabulary that perhaps they've come across whilst they're reading, we might use one of the V for vocabulary sentence stems to help us just pose a question to the group, to an individual child, to pairs of children to discuss and come back and reflect on. So what does the word so-and-so mean in this sentence? Find and copy a word, or find and write on your whiteboard a word that you think means this. Just quick and easy tools to help us be able to set those kinds of questions. And similarly, if we're working with older children, we might be focusing more on that inference and being able to justify those inferences, being able to read between the lines. So a set of sentence stems that just help us think on the top of our heads, but really good quality questions to aim at that particular comprehension. And if that's something that you're particularly interested in, behind the screenshot that's appeared on your screen now is a link to a Word document that I've created that just puts all of those question stems into one resource. I have one with me now and I'm doing guided reading as a prompt. Similarly, if you're interested in thinking as an individual or with your colleagues about the types of role that the teacher takes before, during and after reading, but also the role that the children take in that before they read, during that reading and after the reading, and that kind of menu over time, there's a Word document with a link behind on the screen that you're welcome to use and fiddle with should you wish to. So again, in my travels working with schools, in many schools where guided reading takes place, the children are provided with tasks to complete after that teaching session, often the following day during that guided reading time when the teacher is working with another group of learners. And these types of activities are often where the readers are asked to respond to what they read the day before, as suggested in the descriptions of learning, as we mentioned earlier. So offering their opinions, offering to summarise, and the guidance in the progression steps there gives us a flavour of what that progression might look like with regards to response, So if I can just give you a flavour of some of the things certainly that I've used and then I've seen other teachers using to just, I guess, demonstrate the simplicity really, because these are activities that we want the children with a very brief explanation to be able to go and engage in independently as part perhaps of a carousel of activities, or after they have read with the teacher or the teaching assistant the day before. This is a really simple example that could be used at the end of a teaching session, where perhaps the children might be asked to choose one, or they might be given one of the sentence stems, or they might be asked to choose 2 or 3, or they might be asked to reflect on all of these things in relation to what they've read the day before and express their response to that text. This is particularly nice as children get older in the primary range, when they're asked to read and imagine, or read and feel and express emotions. And these can be as few or as many as you would like for the children to engage with. This is an example inspired by the work of Aidan Chambers in his fantastic book, Tell Me, Reading Children and Talk, which is a fantastic piece of reading material and research to have in any primary school. I would say a fantastic resource. And in this case, the children are invited to reflect on one or all of these, where they're asked to think about what they liked, what they disliked, perhaps what they found puzzling, or thinking about identifying patterns in what they're reading. This might be something that the children are asked to complete independently. It might be something that the children perhaps are asked to complete during a guided reading session, particularly when we're talking about groups of able readers, where some children naturally are more fluent and read at a faster pace than others. And the worst thing in that guided reading teaching session is where 1 or 2 of the children are finished and sitting waiting for other children, and those children then feel pressure to speed up and not read with as much comprehension. So perhaps this is one of the kinds of activities we could provide for those speedy readers to keep them busy thinking about what they've been reading, but also acts as a deterrent for those children who race to be first, perhaps without reading with that full comprehension. And as ever, something like the likes, dislikes, puzzles and patterns works fantastically for independent use, as long as the teacher has taken the time to teach it perhaps to the whole class as part of their literacy work. So, and modelling, what does it mean to think about likes and dislikes? So, for example, the teacher might be modelling that likes are around what do we like about particular characters? What do we like about particular events in a narrative? Perhaps it's about what do we like in terms of really juicy vocabulary, or really unusual phrases, or really atmospheric descriptions. Similarly, if we're modelling children thinking about puzzles, it could be what questions do we have for the writer? If we could ask the writer about this, what would we ask them? What about questions about the way that characters have behaved, about the way that language has been used, about particular themes that are developing? So the likes, dislikes, puzzles, patterns, a lovely follow-up activity. Similarly, I know lots of schools have created some really engaging and enticing reading reviews, book review materials for children to complete on occasion. And I'm just including here links behind the images on the slide, a series of progressive book reviews that come from our colleagues at the Books Council of Wales, looking at progressively slightly more complex ways of responding to texts. Again, I see some fantastic simplification, adaptation of the EAS Top 10 reading response activities, ensuring that they are at a level that is accessible independently as part perhaps of a follow-up to a guided reading session. The true or false seen used widely by the teacher, providing just a couple of statements for the children to respond to, with that prove it with words and phrases justifying from the text. And similarly, simple activities that help, particularly with a focus on vocabulary, help our learners to focus in on those challenging words that they perhaps might be able to decode reasonably successfully. But again, that full comprehension, that deep meaning of vocabulary may not be there. So providing perhaps a really simple performer that the children can use regularly. What was the word that perhaps you found challenging, or that you think perhaps somebody else might have found challenging? What do you predict might be the definition for that word? How would you explain the meaning of that word for somebody else? And then let's have a look in the dictionary, maybe. Simple, repetitive activities that can be used time and time again. So I'd like to suggest that some of the practicalities and around guided reading, which are enormous, are the make or break of our guided reading activities. And I would definitely suggest that to have a sort of toolkit, a toolbox for each practitioner that leads guided reading is a necessity. I'll show you mine. Mine is a zippy bag, which has a variety of materials in. And if I show you, as on the slide there, you can see I have a copy of my Vipers, instead of as an A4, as an A5 laminate, that I can use in front of me when I'm thinking of those high quality questions at the end of the session. I also have my little zippy bag with a collection of reading strategies that I might use and choose with different groups of children to focus in at the beginning of a session, to get them ready to read, but also refer to after reading, how well did we get on with this particular strategy? Who managed to use it and how well did we get on? Again, a classic whiteboard and pen for all of those times, particularly perhaps with younger children where before they read, we might need to do a little bit of recap with some high frequency words or graphemes to recognise for their decoding. And also, I recommend having some of those follow-up tasks. I have them as laminates ready to go for those children who partway through a session perhaps are already finished reading and need something purposeful to keep them busy while everybody else carries on, or simply to be able to model a part of with your group before they go away and continue that the following day. So to have that kind of toolkit, I think it's a big job, but somebody's got to do it. 2 years ago, Estin produced a thematic report in which the following statement that you can see on the screen appeared there. They identified that guided group reading as part of a combination of approaches, a rich reading curriculum is part of successful schools. The use of the carousel is mentioned with a focus on it being well planned and reading based. So I know from my work with many schools across 5 authorities, where many schools are using guided reading right through the school, that carousel, that range of reading activities that individuals or groups of learners are engaged in whilst the adult is working with a particular teaching group, it's essential that that runs as smoothly as possible. And I just wanted to share with you a few of the kinds of activities that I see being used as part of that reading carousel. So, for example, the use of, in some cases, a group of children where they still have access to the text that they used in their teaching session, perhaps returning to that text, perhaps to read around or to buddy up and take turns reading to each other. Rereading text is one of the most effective ways of developing children's fluency as they revisit text to reread and become more confident and fluent with sequences of words and language patterns. That fluency is enhanced. So you might want to consider having one of those tasks be reread text with a partner, as a group, as a round robin activity, so that they're really enhancing that fluency and expression. Often groups of learners are given activities to practice their high frequency word recognition, matching high frequency words, identifying them, finding them in text, numbering them, playing the high frequency word bingo, all those kinds of things where it's about that, trying to encourage the children to see and say those keywords. You can see the range online, on the screen there. Some of the things that I think enhance the use of this carousel: visual timetable, really important. Children can see it and access it and can clearly see at their level in their language what it is that they are engaging in on a daily basis. So I would highly recommend a visual timetable for the children. Different schools have found different ways to ensure that children value the work they do in that independent time. In some schools, and again, there's no right answer to this, but different schools trying different things. In some schools, a guided reading book is used, such as a reading journal, perhaps, that the children is theirs, they decorate it's theirs for a period of time, and it's used to capture all of those independent reading activities that happen over time. Whereas in other schools, perhaps the children, each of them has a loose leaf folder where individual pieces of work are gathered and kept all together. I'm not sure that there's a right answer to that, but what is important is that the children see enough value in those activities that they put the effort in and they engage as fully as you want them to in those reading activities. I see the use of Pobble 365 as talk tasks, where groups of children go online and access pictures and questions around pictures to engage in visual comprehension and discussion. See a lot of use of online research materials, such as websites like Newsround, websites like Kids National Geographic, things like First News, used in a lot of our schools as a regular go-to source of reading enjoyment and research. So as we come close to the final stretch of our session, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, less than 2 weeks ago, a new thematic report, Developing Pupils' English Reading Skills from 11 to 14 years of age, was published by Estin, where I've extracted the following statement. It talks about the use of guided reading for older, more able readers remaining a valuable aspect of reading provision, where pupils read either still with an adult and access those higher order reading skills, strategies and response activities, or they work without an adult to build their confidence and their collaborative skills, particularly as they move up through the primary phase. And something that is a relatively new find for me is the use of reciprocal teaching. Now, it may well be that some of you already use this and are using it very successfully, but when Estin perhaps refer to children leading sessions themselves, I imagine that this is what they're referring to, the use of reciprocal reading. And this refers to reading activity where the children become the teachers in small groups. So the teacher works with that group over a series of sessions to model the use of this technique, and then helps the student to learn to guide the groups themselves using in particular 4 strategies. And it teaches the children to take on the role for a session of the predictor, where they offer predictions about what the author will tell the group, what's going to happen next, what's coming up in the next chapter that they're about to read. That predictor often will be the person who gets the ball rolling in that reciprocal reading session. The question generator is given that role in the group of being the person who poses questions. Might be in relation to those predictions, it might be in relation to the kinds of opinions that people are going to share about the text or about the information that they're reading. So the predictor and the questioner. The third role is the role of the clarifier. And for most children in the primary, that might be particularly that role of clarifying vocabulary. Are we clear about what these words mean? Identifying those more challenging vocabulary in the text that the children are reading as a group, and helping the rest of the group to focus in. They might be the person who makes some prediction, has access to the dictionary to facilitate that kind of clarification work in the group. And finally, the summariser, who is charged with, at different points during the reading session, I'm just going to give you a summary of where we've got up to, summarising the whole of the text as they're reading. So it's thinking of the guided reading session, perhaps for older, more able pupils, where they take that reading session for themselves with no need for the teacher to guide. It's a really effective way of using guided reading, particularly perhaps at the top end of the school. So, finally, and just before I invite you to reflect on the session, individual schools are making decisions about the purpose, the genuine purpose for keeping records for guided reading, group records. This is very much a decision in individual schools, dependent on the range of data that you already keep with regards to the progress that your children make for reading. And where teachers are using records, they are making sure that these records are purposeful in identifying progress, because it's all about the progress that individual learners are making, but also that they're purposeful for the teacher and helping the teacher to identify how the session and that record impacts on the next session. Does it mean that the focus for the next session will vary? Does it give a direction to that next session? And I want to share with you just 2 examples, and you will have access to all of these through the link that I'll share with you in a moment. This example comes from Risca Primary School, where, as you can see, in Risca Primary School, they use the PM reading materials at the colour bands. This reading record is for a group of children who are operating in that blue band and have been assessed to be reading in that blue band. The key skills that are relevant to those children at that stage in their reading development are listed, and for each date that the teacher works with those group members whose names would be at the top of the sheet, the key skills that were a particular focus will be noted, maybe the title of the book, and in perhaps comments about individual children. Very specific, not labour intensive, and has useful information for the teacher. And similarly, we have a set of EAS records that were developed by a teacher working party a number of years, where the record sheet is used for a group over a series of weeks, reference to the descriptions of learning, just as a reference for the teacher. And the statements that are from our previous curriculum, our programme of study for English, are listed in relation to reading strategies, comprehension, response and analysis. And the teacher may well use this by highlighting 1 or 2 focus areas for a session, and then might record on the grid at the bottom success any particular notes worthy of reference to impact on the quality of the session that is next time. So it's not a question of must, it is definitely a question of individual schools deciding whether keeping records of the assessment that goes on through the guided reading is purposeful, useful, and manageable. And on that, I'm going to draw us to a close and encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, to consider, from what I've run through at pace this afternoon, is there anything that you're going to go away and think about? Anything that you need to talk to anybody else about in relation to your current practice in school? Anything that you think I'm going to have a go and try yourself, and anything perhaps that you might want to share with others. And as I say, I'm going to provide you with a link in the chat